The chamber smelled of recycled air and old institutional certainty, that particular staleness that gathers in rooms where important decisions have been made for a very long time by people who stopped questioning their own conclusions. Sub-arbiter. Thessan Vox had spent 42 standard cycles in rooms exactly like this one, and he had learned to read the smell the way a navigator reads stellar drift, as a reliable indicator of where power sat and how long it had been sitting. The deliberation hall of the conclave's 7th tier was, in Thessan Vox's considered assessment, a room that had never been surprised. Long curved benches of polished Threnic stone arranged in a descending semicircle, 12 seats to a tier, 7 tiers total. Holographic displays floated at each station, cool blue light pooling on carapace and scale and dermis in equal measure. At the center of the floor, a single standing position, circular, slightly recessed, lit from above. The position was called the clarification point by tradition, though everyone who worked in the building knew it as the well. You stood in the well when you had been called to account. Thessan Vox had seen 311 individuals stand in the well over his career. None of them had been comfortable. The woman standing there now had her hands folded loosely at the small of her back, and she looked, as far as Thessan Vox could interpret the facial arrangements of her species, faintly bored. Her name was Captain Ilara Vasquez, according to the data pad in his secondary appendage. She had been waiting in the well for 11 minutes before the session was formally called to order because 2 of the junior arbiters had been delayed in transit. Thessan Vox had watched her through the observation glass during those 11 minutes, expecting some sign of the restlessness his files indicated was characteristic of human physiological architecture at rest. She had not moved. She had not paced. She had stood with her feet at exactly shoulder width and her eyes aimed at the far wall at a height that suggested she was looking at something that was not the wall, and she had waited with a stillness that Thessan Vox found, without quite being able to articulate the reason, deeply unsettling. The preliminary file on Captain Ilara Vasquez was thin. That was the first anomaly. Every other individual who had stood in the well over Thessan Vox's career had come with documentation, records of service, institutional assessments, commendations, reprimands, psychological evaluations, medical histories. Vasquez had her rank, her service number, 3 confirmed deployments to contested space, and a single line of notation from the Galactic Council's Human Integration Oversight Committee that read, in its entirety, "Outcomes pending review." Thessan Vox had been doing this long enough to know that a thin file was never an absence of information. It was a redaction. The session opened with the standard forms. Sub-arbiter, Thessan Vox identified for the record. Principal Hevrath Sosk identified. Vice-arbiter, Crindley Ash identified. The 2 junior arbiters whose delay had kept the woman waiting identified in the slightly chastened tones of the reliably tardy. The human in the well did not blink during any of this. Her translator implant was visible at the base of her left ear, a flat disc of standard issue brushed metal. When Thessan Vox spoke directly to her, acknowledging her presence for the formal record, asking if she required any accommodations before the proceedings began, she said, "No, thank you," in a voice that the translator rendered as textbook standard galactic, clear and even, and carrying about as much information as a calibration tone. Principal Hevrath Sosk took the first question, as was protocol. Hevrath Sosk was Kaldrathi, a species whose physiological tell for displeasure was a faint darkening of the dermis along the secondary neck ridge, and that ridge was already reading a medium gray as the arbiter arranged the relevant documents on the holographic display. "Captain Vasquez," Hevrath Sosk began. The conclave has convened this session in response to a formal petition from 7 member species requesting a comprehensive review of the Human Combat Integration Program. Specifically, the petitioning members have raised concerns regarding what they describe as a systematic underassessment of the psychological and operational risks presented by human service members in active deployment zones. Before we proceed to the formal questions, I want to be clear. This review is not disciplinary. You have been called as an active participant in the program precisely because your file was flagged as representative of the broader pattern the petition describes. A pause. The dermis along Sosk's neck ridge went a shade darker. The petition characterizes human soldiers as categorically fragile. Vasquez let that sit in the air for a moment. She had a quality that Thesson Vox was having difficulty naming. Not stillness exactly, because stillness implied the absence of energy, and there was no absence of energy in the way she occupied the well. It was more like readiness in storage, potential in a very small container. She said, "I understand. You do not wish to contest the characterization? I'm waiting to hear what evidence they presented." Hevrath Sosk made a sound that the translator rendered as a considered clearing of the throat. The data pad shifted. The petitioning species cite the documented physiological limitations of the human form. Shorter average lifespan than 12 of the 14 member species. Higher baseline pain response than 8 of 14. Skeletal density approximately 30 to 40% below the conclave's median combat species rating. Dependence on ambient oxygen at concentrations that restrict deployment environments. 7 identified genetic predispositions to degenerative conditions that manifest under sustained combat stress. Sosk set the data pad down with the particular care of someone placing a difficult argument in the open where everyone can examine it. The petition concludes that, on measurable biological criteria, humans are among the most fragile species currently serving in active combat roles within conclave space, and that their continued deployment at current rates constitutes a negligence on the part of the Human Integration Oversight Committee. Vasquez unfolded her hands. She looked at the data pad, then at Hevrath Sosk, then at Thesson Vox, and then back at Sosk. What might have been a small smile crossed her face, though Thesson Vox's species recognition training flagged the expression as ambiguous. It carried the structural markers of both amusement and the thing humans did with their mouths when they were preparing to say something they had already decided to say. "Can I ask a question?" she said. "That is the purpose of this session," Sosk replied. "On the lifespan data, are they measuring from the current historical mean or from the pre-integration baseline?" A silence entered the room. Thesson Vox watched Hevrath Sosk's secondary neck ridge. It went darker still, the particular gray of someone doing arithmetic they had not been asked to do, and arriving at a number they had not expected. Junior Arbiter Pellis, the younger of the 2 Raxian members of the panel, leaned forward over the holographic display, consulting something quickly, and then leaned back. "The petition cites the current galactic integration mean for human lifespan," Sosk said, recovering. "We use a standardized comparative metric across all species." "Right," Vasquez said. "What's the pre-integration baseline?" Another silence. Pellis checked the display again. "Approximately 43 standard galactic years," Pellis said, "at the point of first contact." Vasquez nodded. "And the current mean?" 71.4. A beat. Standard galactic years, corrected for the integration calendar. Vasquez said nothing. She let that mathematics do its own work in the room for a moment, standing in the well of the deliberation hall while the numbers settled over the assembled arbiters like something that had been dropped from a height. Sosk said, The petition is measuring against current galactic norms, not against historical human. I know, Vasquez said. I'm just noting that in the space of roughly 4 generations of contact with the Conclave, humans managed to extend their functional lifespan by approximately 65%. Through adaptation. That's the thing the petition is measuring. Without noticing, it's measuring it. Thesson Vox wrote a note on his own datapad. He was careful to make the notation small. The session moved through its formal questions at the pace that institutional proceedings always moved, measured, with pauses for notation and cross-reference. The slightly ritual quality of a process that has formalized itself so thoroughly that the procedure and the purpose have become nearly indistinguishable. Vasquez answered each question. She answered without elaboration, without deflection, and without the defensive posture that Thesson Vox had observed in every other individual who had stood in the well. When she did not know something, she said so. When the panel cited a statistical comparison that she believed was methodologically flawed, she said so with the same flat tone she used for everything else, as if correct information and incorrect information both deserved the same register. Vice Arbiter Crindali Ash, whose species read situational threat through scent rather than visual tells, shifted twice in the first quarter hour of proceedings. Thesson Vox noticed. Ash was Solvati, a species whose threat detection chemistry was ancient and involuntary and accurate in ways that institutional training could channel, but never fully override. The Solvati did not shift in their seats because they were uncomfortable with the proceedings. They shifted when their primary nervous system was registering the presence of a predator and their secondary nervous system was overruling the impulse to back away. Thesson Vox had known Crindali Ash for 19 standard cycles. He had never seen Ash shift twice. The formal questions eventually ran to the matter of Vasquez's most recent deployment. This was the section of the session Thesson Vox had been waiting for, because it was the section most directly connected to the petition's central claim, and because the file notation outcomes pending review attached to that deployment was, he had now confirmed through the morning's records access, not a redaction but a genuine gap. The Conclave did not have the data. Captain Vasquez, Hevrath Sosk said, the petition references your service with the 3rd Human Contingent during the Kellen Station engagement. Specifically, the petition claims that the casualty rate among human service members during that engagement supports the fragility argument in that human soldiers absorb disproportionate combat damage relative to non-human members of the same unit. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. The expression that crossed her face this time was not ambiguous. It was the kind of quiet that came from somewhere specific, the quiet of a cost that had been paid and not forgotten, and did not need to be dramatized. Disproportionate is one way to frame it, she said. The petition uses the word reckless in its supporting documentation, Sosk said. Vasquez took a breath. How many Conclave casualties at Kellen Station? Sosk checked the display. 43 confirmed, across 6 non-human units. How many civilian casualties in the station sectors where non-human units were assigned? A pause, longer than the previous pauses. Pellis was checking the display again, and this time, the junior arbiter's tail, which had been resting flat against the bench, lifted slightly at the base in a way that indicated the numbers being located were not the numbers Pellis had been expecting to locate. The petition does not include civilian casualty breakdowns by sector, Sosk said carefully. I have them, Thesson Vox said. He had prepared more thoroughly than the session protocol required. It was a habit that had served him well over 42 standard cycles. Sectors assigned to non-human units, 412 civilian casualties, Sectors assigned to human units, 11. The silence this time was different in quality from the earlier silences. The earlier silences had been the silence of arithmetic. This one was the silence of something larger being recalculated. Crindly Ash shifted again. Vasquez did not look at Thesson Vox. She kept her eyes on Hevrath Sosk, and her face had returned to the expression that Thesson Vox could not categorize. Neither satisfaction nor grief, neither pride nor shame. Something that existed in the space where all of those things overlapped and could not be cleanly separated. The disproportionate damage wasn't recklessness, she said. We were choosing where to put our bodies. Sosk said after a moment, "Could you clarify that statement for the record?" The 11 civilian casualties were in sectors with the densest non-combatant population density in the station. We requested those sectors specifically. We knew they'd take more fire because the tactical geometry of the station's layout meant that clearing those sectors required moving through open approaches. We knew that before we went in. You knew the casualty risk to your own personnel was higher, Sosk said. Yes. And you chose those sectors anyway. We preferred our casualties to theirs. The sentence went into the room and did what only very simple, very clear sentences can do in a space accustomed to institutional complexity. It sat there, irreducible, and the room arranged itself around it. Sosk's secondary neck ridge had gone past gray into something closer to the deep charcoal the Kaldrathi displayed when processing information that did not fit their existing frameworks. Junior Arbiter Pellis had stopped consulting the data display entirely. Crindly Ash, the Solvathi Vice Arbiter, sat with both hands flat on the bench surface, which Thesson Vox recognized as the posture Solvathi used when they were actively overriding a flight response and choosing, through deliberate effort, to remain in a room. The session continued. It had been scheduled for 90 minutes, and the institutional machinery of the conclave did not easily bend to the scale of what was being said inside it. There were more questions. The record required them. Hevrath Sosk, to the Arbiter's considerable credit, asked them with precision, even as the framework the petition had provided continued to quietly dismantle itself around every exchange. It was during the second hour that the session broke from its protocol, and it broke because of Junior Arbiter Pellis. Pellis had been quiet for nearly 40 minutes, consulting the display with an increasing focus that had drawn Thesson Vox's attention, and when Pellis finally spoke, it was not a formal question, but something closer to a genuine one, the kind that surfaces when an institutional mind encounters data it does not have a category for. Captain Vasquez, Pellis said, I have been reviewing the human unit engagement records from the Scraith incursion, the full 3-cycle period, not just Kellen Station. Vasquez waited. I am looking at the attrition data. The number of human service members who were wounded in action and returned to active deployment within the same engagement period. Pellis consulted the display for another moment. The figure is approximately 73%. Of all human personnel who sustained combat injuries above the standard threshold for non-human units, injuries that would constitute grounds for immediate medical withdrawal and 6 to 12 standard months of recovery under conclave protocols, 73% of those individuals returned to active deployment within the same engagement. Vasquez nodded. That sounds about right. How? Pellis said, and the word came out with a plainness that had nothing to do with institutional formality and everything to do with genuine incomprehension. How is that physiologically possible given the documented fragility parameters? Vasquez considered that for a moment. Can I ask you something? Please, Pellis said. In your species' evolutionary history, were you ever prey? Pellis's tail lifted again. What? Was your species, at any point in your evolutionary history, something that other things hunted? Something that larger, faster predators were actively trying to kill and eat? Pellis looked at the panel members on either side, which meant Pellis did not immediately know the answer or knew the answer and was not certain it was relevant. The Raxian evolutionary lineage is primarily aquatic, Pellis said carefully. Our primary environmental pressures there were large predators, yes, in the early periods. Were there periods where your ancestors had to keep moving even when they were injured? Because stopping meant dying? A pause. In theory, yes. The paleobiological records indicate. For us, it wasn't in theory, Vasquez said. For us, it was Tuesday. Another silence, and this one had texture in it. A complicated weave of discomfort and something that might have been the early stages of a much larger reassessment. For several million years, Vasquez continued, and her voice had shifted, not softer, but slower, the way narration slows when the thing being described requires exactly the right amount of space. We were not the apex predators on our planet. We were small, medium density, endurance-capable omnivores on a continent full of things that were faster, stronger, larger, better armed by natural biology than we were. And we survived anyway. We survived because we are, on a fundamental neurological level, very difficult to convince to stop. There is something in human biochemistry, adrenaline, cortisol, the specific way our pain processing is architected, that under sufficient threat essentially overrides the signals that would tell a more sensibly constructed organism to lie down and wait for help. She paused. It's not heroism. It's not toughness. It's just that we are descended from the ones who kept moving when everything else stopped. Krindali Ash said, and the vice arbiter's voice was very controlled. That sounds like a trauma response at the species level. That's one word for it, Vasquez said. Our therapists use similar language. A small thing happened in the room then, something that Thess and Vox had not seen happen in the well in 42 standard cycles of service. Someone laughed. It was Pellis, and it was the laugh of a mind very brief, and it was the laugh of a mind that has been handed something its frameworks cannot process and has chosen nervous release over catastrophic cognitive failure. Sosk's neck ridge flickered. Ash pressed both hands harder against the bench. Thess and Vox made another notation on his datapad, and this time it was not small. The third hour arrived without formal acknowledgement and with everyone at the bench making the tacit collective decision to not consult the session clock. There was more ground to cover. The philosophical exchange that had been building since Vasquez arrived in the well had not yet reached what Thess and Vox recognized as its natural terminus, the point at which the institutional question becomes a genuinely existential one, where the case being made stops being about specific numbers and becomes about what the conclave is asking when it deploys human soldiers and what humans are answering when they go. It was Thess and Vox himself who asked it. He had been quiet for the better part of 2 hours, which was his practice in sessions where the material was moving faster than the formal structure could contain it. Quiet observation produced better data than eager participation, and he had 42 cycles of evidence for that conclusion. Captain Vasquez, he said, and his voice in the room was dry and precise in the way that things which have been used for a long time settle into precise shapes. The petition's concluding argument is not biological. The biological argument, I think we have established, rests on a comparative frame that does not adequately account for certain variables. He glanced at Sosk, who inclined the primary head in something that translated as concession. The concluding argument is philosophical. The petitioning species contend that the Human Integration Oversight Committee, by deploying human soldiers at current operational scales, is making use of a resource that carries long-term risks the conclave has not adequately assessed. Vasquez waited. Specifically, Thesson Vox continued, the petition argues that a species which has demonstrated this particular combination of physiological persistence, psychological willingness to absorb cost, and what one of the petitioning documents calls a cultural habituation to organize violence, that such a species, integrated into conclave military frameworks, poses a question the conclave has not yet formally answered. He set his data pad down. What happens when the threats the humans are fighting for us are gone? What happens when there is nothing left for them to stand between? The silence that followed was the longest of the session. Vasquez stood in the well with her hands at the small of her back, and she was looking at something on the far wall again. The same imaginary fixed point she had been looking at during those 11 minutes before the session began. Thesson Vox watched her and waited. I'd have to ask, she said finally, how long the conclave has been wondering that. Thesson Vox said, it is the concern the petition does not say directly but implies throughout. I know. Her eyes came back to him. Can I tell you something honestly? That is the purpose of the well, Thesson Vox said. We're not a threat, she said. I can't promise that in an official capacity. I can't make a guarantee that will satisfy a philosophical review. But I can tell you that the reason we keep going back is not because we like it. The reason we keep going back to the contested zones, the stations that are taking fire, the colony worlds where something bad is happening to people who can't handle what's happening to them. The reason we volunteer for the dangerous sectors, the reason we specifically request the approaches that are going to cost us more is because someone has to do it, and we've determined that we're the best candidates available. She looked at Pellis, at Ash, at Sosk, and then back at Thesson Vox. We're not going to turn that on the conclave. We're not going to finish clearing out the things that are hurting people and then look around at the people we were protecting and decide they're next. That's not what this is. How do we know? Ash said quietly, and the Solvati's voice had the particular quality of something very old being asked, very simply. The same way you know anything, Vasquez said. You watch what we do when it costs us. You watch what we do when nobody is watching. At Kellen Station, we didn't have observers when we requested the high-density sectors. We didn't have conclave review boards watching us choose to eat the casualty rate so the civilians went home. We just did it because that's what the situation needed. She paused. I've had this conversation in different forms about 40 times in the past 3 years. Different committees, different review boards, different arbiters with different philosophical frameworks and different species-specific anxieties. And every single time, the thing I come back to is the same thing. She took a breath. We have been pointing weapons at each other since before we had metals to make them from. We've been fighting each other for every resource we ever wanted, every piece of land, every ideology, every god. For the entire span of human history, the most reliable threat to any given human was almost certainly another human. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, we built hospitals. We wrote codes that said, you don't shoot the medics. We made rules about who you're allowed to hurt and in what circumstances. And we court-martialed the ones who broke the rules, and we did all of that not because we were told to by a galactic body with the authority to compel compliance, but because we decided, on our own, that there was a line. Thesson Vox's data pad sat untouched. He was not writing anything. The conclave didn't give us those rules, she said. We showed up to the galactic community with them already installed. That's not an accident. That's several thousand years of humans deciding what kind of species we wanted to be, with nothing but our own judgment to guide us. Krindali Ash had not moved in several minutes. The Solvathi's hands were still flat on the bench, and the Vice Arbiter's eyes were tracking Vasquez with the focused, slightly helpless attention of a species whose nervous system was registering one signal and whose mind was processing another. Hevrath Sosk's neck ridge had gone a color Thesson Vox had never seen in 42 standard cycles of observing Kaldrathi at close range. It was not quite the deep charcoal of cognitive recalibration, and not quite the lighter gray of neutral consideration. It was something between. Junior Arbiter Pellis had closed the holographic display entirely and was watching Vasquez with both of the Raxian's primary eyes wide open and the secondary pair half-lidded in the position that indicated the kind of attention that excludes extraneous information. The session had run to 147 minutes. Hevrath Sosk called a formal recess and asked, in the practiced language of an arbiter who knows the proceedings need room they were not built to contain, that all parties remain available for a secondary consultation within the standard hour. Vasquez said, "Of course." She said it with the same register she had used for everything, not flat exactly, but level, like a table that has been carefully made horizontal. She stood in the well while the arbiters filed out, and she stood there after they were gone, and Thesson Vox lingered at his station because there were notes he told himself he needed to make, and because the truth was more complicated than that. When the chamber was empty, except for the two of them, she said, without looking at him, "How many of those sessions have actually changed anything?" "Fewer than I would prefer," Thesson Vox said. She nodded. "Once." "The petition is going to fail," he said. "The language of the final recommendation will be something like, the Conclave affirms the operational value of the Human Combat Integration Program while committing to ongoing review of deployment parameters. That is the language we use when the evidence compels us to continue something we are still uncertain about." Vasquez made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Ongoing review," she said. "Yes." "That's honest, at least." "It is the most honest thing institutional language can usually manage," Thesson Vox said. She looked at him then, not with any particular weight, but steadily, the way someone looks at a person they have decided is worth the attention. "The thing you asked," she said. "About what happens when the threats are gone." "Yes." "I don't know," she said. "That's an honest answer." "I know it is," he said. "You've been watching." "For a long time," he said. She collected the single item she had brought into the well, a data card in a plain holder, the physical kind rather than the wireless kind, which Thesson Vox noted as a detail that meant she had prepared something specific and wanted to know it could not be remotely altered. She placed it on the edge of the bench in front of Thesson Vox's station. Third-party compiled engagement records. 4 stations, 2 colony worlds, 1 deep space interdiction, all from the past 18 months. Casualty breakdowns by sector, not by unit. Civilian outcome data. She paused. The petition cited the headline numbers. The headline numbers are selective. "I will review them," Thesson Vox said. "I know," she said. She turned and walked toward the chamber exit, and her footsteps were quieter than Thesson Vox expected on the Threnic stone floor, and he found himself thinking again about the quality he had been unable to name all session. That readiness in storage, that potential in a small container. At the exit, she turned, briefly, the way someone turns when they have thought of one more thing that needs saying and have decided to say it. "Sub-Arbiter Vox," she said. "Yes." The petition asked whether humans are fragile. She looked at him for a moment. You might want to think carefully about what word you use instead." Then she was gone, and the door to the deliberation hall closed behind her with the soft precision of an institution that had been shutting doors for a very long time without ever questioning why. Thesson Vox sat alone in the empty chamber with the data card in front of him and the holographic displays casting their cool blue light across the threnic stone benches and the recycled air carrying its old institutional smell and the silence that comes after something has changed in a room, even if nothing in the room looks different. He turned the data card over once in his secondary appendage, feeling the specific weight of something that had been prepared carefully and placed deliberately. And he thought about the woman who had waited 11 minutes without moving and answered every question without deflection and delivered the information that 412 civilians were alive because a group of humans had chosen to put their bodies between the fire and the people who could not endure it. Delivered it with the same level register she used for everything, not as a boast, but as a fact. He thought about what she had said at the end and what she had not said. The question of what happens when the threats are gone was a real question. He understood why the petition had been filed. He understood, moreover, why it would not be the last. In 3 months' time, a secure message would arrive at his private communication node from a routing address logged to a conclave logistics station in the outer Vilhari cluster. The message would be 6 words. Station secure. Thank you for the review. He would spend some time thinking about whether that was a threat or a reassurance, and he would not arrive at a conclusion, and he would find, to his own faint surprise, that he was comfortable with that. It seemed the appropriate condition for a species that had decided to stand in the difficult places and for the institutions that had decided, after much deliberation, to let them. The data card sat on the surface of his desk for 7 days before he read it. Not because he was uncertain whether to read it, he had already decided to read it, had decided in the moment she placed it on the bench, but because in 42 standard cycles of institutional practice, he had learned that evidence presents differently at different distances from the event that produced it, and that the full meaning of a thing was often clearest at the second look rather than the first. When he finally opened the records, he spent 4 hours with them. The data was organized with a precision that he associated with people who had learned, through experience, exactly which specific numbers caused which specific questions to stop being asked. Each engagement was cataloged in 3 columns: sector designation, casualty category, and outcome by population type. Across the 4 stations and 2 colony worlds the card documented, the pattern was consistent. Human units had sustained a combined 409 personnel casualties. Non-combatant casualties in human-assigned sectors across all 6 engagements totaled 23. In sectors assigned to non-human units during the same operations, the number was 914. Thesson Vox sat with those numbers for a long time. He was a careful enough thinker to hold the obvious interpretation at arm's length and interrogate it first. The comparison was not perfectly controlled. Different sectors presented different tactical profiles, different entry geometries, different population densities, different concentrations of hostile force. He knew enough about military operations to understand that no 2 sectors were equivalent, and that drawing clean causal lines between unit assignment and civilian outcome required more variables than any after-action record could fully capture. He also knew that 914 against 23 across 6 independent engagements was not noise. It was signal. He wrote a formal assessment that ran to 19 pages and recommended the petition be declined with a mandate for expanded data collection Across the next 12 months of integration program operations, the Conclave's Human Integration Oversight Committee received the assessment 8 standard days after the session closed. They accepted the recommendation, added 4 pages of their own procedural language, and filed the result under ongoing review. Vox attended the filing confirmation and said nothing that was not required by protocol. And then he walked back to his office through corridors he had walked for 4 decades, past the institutional architecture of a civilization that had been deliberating carefully about difficult things for longer than humans had been writing things down. And he found himself thinking about a young woman standing in a circle of recessed light, with her hands folded at the small of her back, waiting with a quality he had finally found a word for. Not readiness, not potential, patience. The patience of something that has been doing a difficult job long enough to know that the job requires you to wait while the room catches up, and that the room eventually will, and that in the meantime you stand where you are supposed to stand and answer the questions you were asked, and place the data card on the bench where it will be found by whoever is paying careful enough attention. He thought about the colony worlds. He thought about the 23. He thought about what it costs to get that number that low and what kind of species decides in the absence of any institutional requirement that the cost is worth paying. And he thought about what kind of galaxy it was that had been quietly depending on that decision for 3 years without quite understanding what it was depending on. In the Velhari cluster message 3 months later, the woman who had stood in the well would not sign her name. There was no rank, no service number, no identifier of any kind beyond the routing address. Just the 6 words and the weight they carried across the distance between a secured logistics station and a sub-arbiter's private communication node. Station secure. Thank you for the review. Vox read the message twice, and then set his data pad face down on his desk, the way he set things when he wanted them present, but not immediately visible. And he went to the narrow window in his office wall that looked out over the lower tiers of the Conclave's administrative district, the long, clean geometries of institutional architecture, the pale stone that had weathered 1,000 standard years of political weather without changing its surface character, the quiet movement of a civilization that had decided, over many careful deliberations, what kind of civilization it wanted to be. He stood there for a while and thought about that word she had used, the one she had said with the same level register she used for everything. Line. The things they had decided were on the other side of it. The distance they had traveled to arrive at the decision. The question of whether the distance they could still travel was longer or shorter than the distance they had already come, and whether that question had an answer that would ever be entirely comfortable to sit with, and whether comfortable was the right thing to be wanting in the first place. It was still the most honest thing he could think of. Standing at the window with the recycled air carrying its institutional smell, and the blue light of the holographic displays reflecting faintly off the stone corridor walls outside his office door. He stayed at the window until the administrative district went quiet with the standard cycle transition to low operations, the lights dimming in stages the way they had for as long as he had worked in the building, and then he turned back to his desk and opened the next file and continued. He found, in the months that followed, that he was reading differently, not different material. The same institutional briefs, the same integration reports, the same quarterly assessments from the Human Combat Integration Program's oversight structure that crossed his desk in their standard cycle. But he was reading them with a different kind of attention. The attention of someone who has learned that the most important information in a document is often the information the document does not know it is providing. The next casualty comparison data he flagged came from the Threnic corridor operations. Human units, 9 stations. Combined operational period, 14 standard months. He sat with the numbers for a long time again, and this time he did not need 4 hours to understand what he was looking at. The pattern held. It held in the Solvati frontier. It held in the 2 contested deep space engagement zones where the Skruth incursion had pushed farthest into Conclave territory. It held in the single anomalous engagement at the Keller's Rock Station, where human and non-human units had operated in the same sector simultaneously. And the human unit had, according to the record, voluntarily ceded the lower risk approach to the non-human contingent and taken the high exposure corridor themselves, and the after-action report had logged this as a standard tactical decision without editorial comment, because the humans involved had not considered it worth editorializing. He noted all of it. He filed none of it. He was building a picture of something he was not yet ready to name, in the way that a careful observer builds pictures slowly, without forcing the conclusion, letting the shape emerge from the accumulation of data rather than imposing the shape on the data before it was ready to hold it. What he was certain of, working through the pattern across those months, was the thing Vasquez had said that was hardest to argue with. Not the casualty numbers, though, those spoke clearly enough. Not the evolutionary history, though that provided a framework that the petition had conspicuously failed to include in its biological analysis. The thing that stayed with him was the observation about the hospitals, about the codes, about the line that humans had drawn without anyone requiring them to draw it, in the middle of the very history that the petition had cited as evidence of danger. That history of organized violence going back further than human written records, and the simultaneous history of deciding what the rules were, not because an authority imposed the rules, but because the people practicing the violence decided on their own recognizance that there needed to be rules. That was the thing the petition had not measured. That was the variable that the biological comparison frame did not have a column for. 42 standard cycles was enough time to understand that the conclave's decision-making processes were very good at measuring things that fit into existing categories, and less good at measuring things that required new categories to exist. This was not a failure of the institution. It was the nature of all institutions, that they were built to handle the problems their architects anticipated, and that the problems requiring the most careful handling were always, in the end, the ones nobody had quite anticipated. Vasquez had anticipated the question. She had answered it before it was formally asked, in the way she stood in the well, in the way she placed the data card, in the specific shape of the 6 words, in the message that arrived 3 months later. Not a threat, not a reassurance, an information transfer. Station secure. Thank you for the review. The language of a relationship where both parties understand exactly what is being provided and what is being asked, and have decided that the exchange is worth the uncertainty it carries, and will continue making that decision until evidence compels a different one. Thessenvox thought that was probably the most honest framework for what the conclave and humanity had arrived at, through the particular route of committees and petitions and sessions in the well that ran past their scheduled end times. Not alliance, exactly. Not subordination. Something more like 2 parties who have each looked at the available options and concluded that this specific arrangement, with all its uncertainties intact, was the best available arrangement given what both parties were and what the situation required. He was comfortable with that. He noted, with the dry precision that 42 cycles of institutional practice had refined to something very close to an art form, that comfortable was not the same as settled, and that settled was not what the situation called for, and that perhaps the most important thing a careful observer could do was to remain exactly as unsettled as the evidence warranted and to keep watching.